topic, an incredibly salient topic. So I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen. I do tend to talk quickly, so if I start going way too quickly, please do let me know and I will try to slow down. I tell this to my students all of the time as well. And then if I still have not mastered where to put the bars for Zoom when I'm sharing my screen and doing a presentation at the same time. So forgive me if I'm messing around with those a little bit as we go through. So the topic for today is race in America and how did we get here? And the context of this is clearly the number of events that have happened is past 6 to 9 months. And it's not necessarily the events themselves that are significant because there's been this very long history of racial inequality in the United States. However, what's changed in the past 9 months is the amount of attention that these events have gotten and how much more recognition there is that this is an ongoing and systemic problem. So clearly, I'm sure most of these images are familiar to you. Of course, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. The protest is from the federal attempt to put down the protests in Portland, Oregon that were for Black Lives Matter. And then, of course, the maps of New York City that are overlapping demographic characteristics with COVID, as well as percentage of the population that are service workers or frontline workers. So as we all know, these are ongoing problems. What we've seen this summer is nothing new, all the way going back to the literacy laws and the original petty crime laws of the late 1800s through to the protests in the 1960s where people were saying we need integration, protests against integration, as well as protests against police brutality as well against Black populations. So how did we get here? I'm going to offer a two-pronged explanation, but the two prongs actually work in conjunction with each other. So the first prong is going to be practical, talking about policy mechanisms that have intentionally created inequality in this country, as well as the 4 stages of it's actually disenfranchisement, as well as marginalization that have allowed for the advancement and continuation of said inequality. The second prong of this is attitudinal. So we can't have the promotion and the implementation of policy without widespread approval and support for those policies. So we'll get into attitudes regarding race, how they're expressed and or not expressed in order to maintain the system that we have today. So first of all, the creation of inequality through policy. This goes back to the founding of this country. And so if we think about even the Constitution, there has always been a racial pecking order, and that has been institutionalized through policy, law, and government. It's very easy to take the low-hanging fruit of the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, but even the 13th Amendment itself allowed for the continued enslavement of Blacks because of the resistance to abolishment of slavery in the South and the desire and the need for not only free labor, but also the subjugation of Black populations as a matter of social control. Moving on through the New Deal, which everyone is familiar with, at least in the history books, widespread governmental support, welfare, social safety net type of programs that were intended to pull the United States out of the Great Depression. What is less well known about the New Deal is that many of the programs, notably Social Security, were written specifically to limit the amount of benefit that Black populations specifically would be able to receive. The way that they did this was not by writing in, oh, Black people don't get this, but instead by taking more covert measures such as precluding jobs that Black populations tended to inhabit from paying into the Social Security system and thereby benefiting from it. We see these types of policies continue with redlining, which is when the government arbitrarily, well, not arbitrarily, very specifically drew lines around populations of color, particularly Black neighborhoods, but not only all Black neighborhoods, but actually integrated or mixed neighborhoods, because those actually did exist through the 1930s and 40s, and arbitrarily diminished their property values. The other side of this is that it artificially, dramatically inflated the property values of white areas, and white properties. This then also played into the government subsidizing both the creation of the suburbs as well as the subsidization of whites being able to purchase homes in the suburbs, which were for 20 years exclusively white domains. At the same time, or actually following the creation of the suburbs, the government also intentionally created projects, which were isolated communities, specifically filled by communities of color that had fewer economic opportunities, that were more isolated via transportation opportunities and jobs. At the same time, or throughout all of this, the government also tied property taxes to education. And so then this resulted in better neighborhoods whose property values had been artificially inflated, having more money for their schools, meaning that their children had better educations and better job opportunities, better job prospects in the future. And then areas that had their property values artificially deflated then had less money to educate their children. The ongoing effect of all of these policies, it's cumulative and it is exponential and it compounds over generations and over time. And so that no one single policy and no one single element of all of these policies is the sole creation of inequality, but they all tend to work together. The way that we now maintain the hierarchy that is that was created through all of these policies is with laws such as the war on drugs and the, on paper now, allowance for the increased use of police discretion, which we know has resulted in communities of color, individuals of color being targeted by police, being subject to more searches, being treated more roughly by police, but without actually finding any more crime. The war on drugs specifically has quadrupled our prison population for nonviolent offenses. And again, even though whites are just as likely to be found carrying, selling, etc., committing a drug offense, people of color are 3 times more likely to actually be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned for those same offenses. These types of policies have bled over into how we run our schools. And so we started to see an increase in public schools having so-called no tolerance policies. This is when teachers now also have increased discretion in order to punish students for acting out in class in order to create a more conducive learning environment, is how it was put. As with the drug wars, as with the increased police discretion, what we see is that Black and brown children are increasingly the recipients of punitive measures, and increasingly punitive measures that negatively impact their educational quality, their educational achievements, and subsequently their potential prospects moving forward. So what about Black voters? What about voters of color? Something that everybody should be now thinking about, because we are not just subject to policies that some government in a far off place decide to implement. We actually do have a say as voters about who's going to be in office, and do we agree with, do we disagree with the policies that they're implementing? So if we have elected officials who are working against our interests, then we should be able to vote them out of office and put into office people who actually can help us. So this is where I'm going to draw on a historian, Morgan Kauser, from The Undermining of the First Reconstruction, Lessons for the Second. This is actually a working paper that I believe he submitted for congressional testimony in 1981 in defense of the Voting Rights Act. And he talks about, from a historical lens, how if we look at what happened following Reconstruction, so after the Civil War, Reconstruction with the enforcement of the end of slavery, and then with the 15th Amendment, the institution of Black voting rights, how did a lot of those advancements get significantly walked back between 1880 and 1925? So he says that he found that there were 4 stages of Black disenfranchisement, and that these lessons were valuable in 1980 when Congress was considering further changes to the Voting Rights Act. And I believe that they're also applicable for helping us understand what is going on today in the 21st century. So there are 4 stages to Black disenfranchisement per Dr. Kauser in the first Reconstruction. The first stage he calls the Klan stage. Everybody's familiar with the KKK. It was an organization that was created with the intention of violently intimidating Blacks from being an equal part in society, or not even an equal part, but just from participating in politics, right? From asserting some form of rights in the post-Civil War era, right? Their tactics were lynchings, beatings, the burning of crosses, a lot of physical intimidation. Once the physical intimidation phase has succeeded in changing certain amounts of behavior, once it has been well established that if I attempt to vote, I am putting my life or my physical well-being at risk, right? That is well known. The South moved on to the second stage, which he calls the dilution stage. During the dilution stage, people in power shifted from overt physical intimidation to more subtle policy-driven tactics to reduce the efficacy of Black political power. What's important to note in the dilution phase is that there isn't any one thing that they did, right? So in the Klan phase, you can say, oh, lynchings, beatings, etc. With the dilution phase, it was actually, he called it ingenious, in that you never knew what each municipality was going to do in order to reduce Black political power. In some areas where there's a larger Black concentrated population, they might institute a single member district that they could effectively gerrymander in order to reduce their political power. In other municipalities where there was a smaller Black population, they would institute an at-large plurality system because that would be more effective at reducing their political power. So, and also they would institute some laws that seemed as though on their face they were neutral, racially neutral, but their implementation was actually intentional in diluting the power of Blacks specifically. This was followed by the disenfranchisement phase, which is when there was the legal exclusion of Blacks from the electoral system. This is constituted by things that we're all familiar with, such as poll taxes, grandfather clause, and literacy tests. Lastly came the Lily White phase. And this is when they took steps to ensure that even the last vestiges of Black electoral power were removed. Because even with the violence, the vote dilution, disenfranchisement, you still had populations of Blacks that were well off, that were well educated, that still insisted on going to vote. And so what the Lily White phase is how can we make sure that these Blacks have no power to impact the outcome of any election at all? And this is one example of a policy of the Lily White phase would be the white primaries. Only whites could vote in the primaries. All whites got the message that the real election happened during the primaries, not during the general election. Because Blacks were not allowed to vote in the primaries, their vote essentially didn't matter because the candidate was already chosen by the time they had the chance to get to the polls. So I think this is also applicable for today, but instead of just disenfranchisement, we can apply it to understanding minority marginalization at large. So the Klan stage, we do still have the Klan, but we don't talk about the Klan as much, but we do have white supremacists. And we see them increasingly active in the past 20 years. The FBI just said that they are one of the primary terrorist threats in the United States. And what's important to note about the Klan stage, about the violent stage, is that because violence is always readily available, it doesn't actually have to be used. Just the threat of violence, because of this very long entrenched history of the execution and exclusion of violence, is enough to moderate people's behavior. And that what makes white supremacist protesters coming up, showing up at Black Lives Matter protests with guns, even though they quote unquote don't do anything. That is a threatening act that we have seen time and again. If they were to enact the threat, there would probably not be a lot of pushback or legal repercussions, right? There would be a lot of suffering on the side of people of color, not on the side of the people executing the violence. For the dilution phase, how do we weaken the votes and the political power of people of color? We see that today. The things that they did in the late 1800s, change polling locations, consolidate polling locations, change the hours at the polls. We're doing that. We saw Kentucky eliminated half of their polling stations last year. The removal of early voting, changing polling locations so that they're farther away from universities and other places where people may not have as much time to go. That's something that's happening now. That's a form of vote dilution. In the late 1800s, there was something called a petty crimes provision, which was if you committed certain crimes, then you were precluded from being able to vote. The crimes that they listed, lawmakers chose them intentionally, thinking that these certain crimes were more likely to be found in the Black population than in the white population. Today, we see that in felon disenfranchisement because of our criminal justice system that tends to consistently target communities of color. Felon disenfranchisement then has a disproportionate negative impact on the electoral and political power of those communities of color as well. With disenfranchisement, there used to be the poll tax. This is our voter ID laws. It costs money to get an ID. In states where IDs are free, it still costs time, it still costs resources. You have to be able to go to the place during particular times in order to get said identification, all to vote. Those are a modern day poll tax on what we already know are traditionally marginalized populations, populations of color, populations with less money, and older populations. And then lastly, that brings us to the lily white phase. Other people have characterized the lily white phase as a reassertion of white supremacy. This is why in the 1920s, that's when 1920s, we saw the erection of statues venerating Confederate soldiers and Confederate generals, all who had committed treasonous acts, right? So this isn't that wasn't about advocating for the South. That was about advocating for a racial hierarchy and sending a clear signal to other people that that mentality was dominant. Today, we have a president who was elected by saying Mexicans are drug lords, they're criminals, they're violent. Oh, but I'm sure that some of them are nice people. He consistently references Black thugs in the inner city, advocates for violence against protesters of color, supported white supremacy protesters, even when they're committing violent acts against peaceful protesters, right? So he is reasserting a platform of white supremacy. The problem is not just Donald Trump. The problem with this reassertion, with this attitude, is that he is in power and he was elected and has a chance at re-election because a significant portion of the population resonates with that message. The fact that they resonate with that message isn't problematic only in the context of the election of the presidency, but it's because the attitudes that are part of that messaging then impede positive change when we're talking about correcting the racial inequality through policies such as eliminating voter ID laws, eliminating gerrymandering, restructuring our criminal justice system to be more equitable. So that brings us to the attitudes portion of today. So what are the attitudes that we're thinking about? The easiest way to summarize, not from a personal perspective of I'm not saying that this is what people say that they believe, but a good way to characterize from an analytical perspective how we see these attitudes. Like, how would we characterize them? And I would characterize it as a denial of equality. Equality, we can simply, in this context, there's a lot of different ways that we can define this word and apply the term. So for the context of this talk, I'm talking about equality as deserving of the same considerations, concerns, and opportunities as everyone else. So then, who is included in being equal? Who deserves to be treated the same? Who deserves to be treated with the same consideration? Who deserves to receive the same benefits of living in this country? Oftentimes, when we talk about this, we rely on cues such as citizenship. Well, are you American citizen or not? Because if not, well, then I'm not as concerned. Okay. Or we are more sympathetic to people that we perceive as sharing our values. Sometimes this is tied into religion. Sometimes this is tied into region, job occupation, things of this nature. However, what most of these generally come down to in the United States, not all of it, but a large part of it is actually based in race. How is that possible if we're talking about citizenship and all these other things that are incredibly plausible and valid? Well, because we now have what is called race talk. Eduardo Bonilla Silva discusses it as being racism without racists. This race talk is a form of coded language, and it cues and enforces this racial order, the hierarchy that was established through the policy that we talked about a few slides ago. However, the key to race talk is that it's ambiguous. You very rarely actually name race in your race talk. And so then this affords, its power is in the plausible deniability of race talk, okay? And it's important to note the plausible deniability applies both to the speaker as well as the listener. So if I, as a politician, I can be very cognizant that I'm working to cue race, but I can deny that I'm actually doing it. As a listener, I can either acknowledge the cue, or because race talk is so embedded, so deeply embedded in American society, I might not even know that it's there, but it's just something that makes sense or it's something that feels right, even if I can't articulate why. This becomes problematic from a discussion about how do we correct racial inequality, because it precludes discussion and awareness that there is a racial problem to begin with, because we're not talking about race. We're talking about citizenship, we're talking about values or something like that. The quote here that I put at the bottom is Bonilla Silva's definition of racism, in case it is useful for people. He classifies it as a network of social relations at social, political, economic, and ideological levels that shapes the life chances of various races. And it is increasingly covert. It avoids racial terminology, and it renders invisible most mechanisms that produce racial inequality. So again, those mechanisms would be those policies that we talked about before. Sorry, I keep losing my mouse here. There we go. Okay, so race talk, how do we know that it exists then? And is it a real thing? Again, how do we get beyond this plausible deniability? Beyond having had a plethora of examples over the past 150 years, 200 years, we also have proof via admissions that it was an intentional creation, at least from a political side. There was a famous interview with Lee Atwater, who is a prominent strategist for the Republican Party, worked with Reagan and Bush, and he gave a now famous interview to author, I think his first name was Walter Lammas, 20 or 30 years ago, and he talked about the Southern strategy and about how one of the reasons why it worked was because, and what he somewhat advocated for Reagan, was that you could no longer talk about race overtly and still be successful. You can't use the N-word anymore because it's more broadly accepted that that type of racism is wrong. So what you do then to make people feel better, to make people feel like we're advancing, is you start to talk about increasingly abstract topics, starting with busing, right? But busing was still clearly related to race. So from busing, you move to taxation. So then taxation, I can talk about, oh, well, I work hard, my economic well-being, I'm worried about my family, to housing, war on drugs, tough on crime, etc. Right? So clearly I added on those policies. But the lesson that he gave was the more you talk about these more abstract, increasingly abstract policies, is people no longer have to worry about talking about race, even though the clear outcome of those policies is that people of color suffer more. One of the ways that we then, instead of talking about race, validate our quote unquote race neutral position on these policies is by relying on our American values. The prime American values that people tend to take pride in are individualism and hard work. We love an underdog story. I took handouts from nobody, nobody helped me, I worked really hard, I was my own person. I believe in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. So then, when we talk about racial inequality, the problem becomes the individual. If you would just work harder, if you would go to school, if you don't like where you live, then you should move. If you would just do what police tell you, then they wouldn't shoot you, right? Because it is not about policy anymore. It's about the individual, because I worked hard, I did right, therefore you should do this too. So at the end of the day, then, you can't fix what you don't see. Okay? I've removed race from the conversation, so then I don't actually see the policies. I don't see the societal level impact, the societal level influences that are creating the context in which you as an individual are making decisions. Okay, so if you are only the individual, because all I see are the individual, then the policies don't matter. Okay? Further, because I see racism as bad, because people see racism as bad, we don't want to be racist. We acknowledge that racism is bad. This is great movement. This is great progress, right? However, what this cues into is, well, I don't see race, and so you shouldn't either. If you bring up race and racial inequality and say there are these societal level influences that create differential opportunities, and therefore it's a larger problem that should be corrected through policy, you say, well, why are you always making this about race? Because if you would only work harder then. Okay, so do you see how that works? It's if you focus on the individual and say, well, I as an American, my true American values are individualism and hard work. If you uphold those values, then you're not going to complain about race. Okay. This then, all put together, can be seen as the culmination of the lily white phase. Okay, so our inability to see racial inequality at the systemic level because of our focus on the individual, right? So this inclusive of in the political system, right? Our inability to see racial inequality at the systemic level as the creation of policy then results in the opposition to work to create that inequality. Just as with the disenfranchisement, it was the effort to completely remove Blacks' ability to impact the outcome of the election. The lily white phase from the perspective of racial inequality and marginalization is the ability to completely remove the validity of the complaint of racial inequality. If your complaint is not valid, if I can't even see what the problem is, then there's no way that I'm going to work to try to correct it. So if we put it all together, our inequalities were created by policy, and they were intentional, invisible by intention. These have a generational and compounding impact, and changing the direction and the negative outcomes of these policies is impeded by attitudes that are focused more on the individual rather than the society, even when those individuals are partaking in race talk and feed into the hierarchy of racial inequality themselves. On the plus side, because I don't always want to be super doom and gloom about things like this, is that recognizing and understanding how these problems and inequalities were created through policy indicates necessarily that solutions also then can come through policy, and they should. We're not talking about individual level unique one-offs. We're talking about systemic, predictable, systematic problems that have developed and culminated over time. Those can only be appropriately responded to through policy. Also, as we've seen this summer, attitudes are changing. All of you are here today. There's growing support and awareness that, oh, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee, he actually had a valid complaint, right? That there maybe is something else that's going on that's a bigger problem than we were aware of before. So then perhaps this changing of attitudes we can also apply, and instead of talking about the 4 stages of disenfranchisement and marginalization, perhaps we're at the beginning of the 4 stages of social progress. Thank you very much. That is all I have for you, and I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. So I think we have some in the chat box that I can read off if no one has any questions, or if you did put your questions in the chat box too, feel free to, if you want to read them off instead of that. But I have one here. It says, Nicole Hannah-Jones points out that racism has its roots in the psychological rationalization of North American slavery developed in the 1700s. How do we move forward to erase this historical rationalization?
That's a great question. And the way I put it to my students, I developed a Black Excellence module for my race and politics class this fall. And the way that I explained it to them was, when we look at racial inequality and the way that people of color are treated today, the way to understand it is in the denial of humanity. And I used to have that in this talk as well when I was talking about denial of equality, but it is actually a very, very, very deep-seated denial of humanity that originally was based in not seeing Blacks as humans. And there was a lot of, this is where you see like the genetics movement, the biological racism explanation for, well, Blacks are just inferior, therefore we shouldn't give them an education because it wouldn't matter anyways. So we've had this very long, deep-seated history of believing in a biological rationalization for the mistreatment of Blacks because we don't see them as human beings. We do not see them as equal. So then how do we get beyond that? One, recognizing that it's there and that it is so deep-seated that, and just kind of like the air that we breathe, we don't necessarily recognize it because it's just normal, unfortunately. So then we do things to directly counter that dialogue, that subconscious dialogue. And so I've assigned my students a Black Excellence project. And because of this deep-seated denial of Black humanity, we are also pre-programmed not to readily recognize when people of color excel. And so I challenge them to look for the multitudes of examples of incredible people of color, well, in this class specifically, Black people specifically, that are doing excellent things and that deserve more recognition that they're not getting. So that's one way of that I'm doing it within my class. As part of broader society, I would recommend something along those lines as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about Black excellence, but about working to identify when we as individuals are less likely to recognize other people's success, other people's achievements, and then also pushing for, I would say, if you're looking for a policy level solution, pushing for change of policies that implicitly deny that ability to succeed, that willingness to succeed as well.
Wonderful. So I'm gonna mix it up a little bit because I have another 2 questions from the same person. But before that, Someone said, systemic racism has been understood in the Black and Brown community for years. Yet why haven't the major justice-focused organizations made changes, i.e. the NAACP, the ACLU, and they list off a few other organizations?
Why haven't they made changes? Oh, why haven't they been able to change systemic racism? I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
Yeah, so I guess the person who put that question in, if you can just put in a just clarification, and then I can ask another question in the meantime, if that works. So another example of dilution unique to the COVID-19 era is delaying the sending and processing of certain absentee ballots, a practice which is widespread, particularly in the Southeast. To what extent does the popularity of Trump's platform of implicit white supremacy evidence of failure of our public and private schools to train our citizens to think critically and make independent, rational decisions? What can be done about the problem?
There's a lot of problems there. I'm gonna have to read this. So the problem of a lack of education. So I actually have a friend, a Black man, grew up in Indiana, and he calls it the South. And his mom would actually talk about how the disembowelment of civic education in public schools is intentional in order to create a population that is more controllable. And when I'm teaching my classes, and we've clearly been talking about voter registration, electoral participation, how do you find out who's on the ballot? I'm from Seattle, so in Washington State, they actually mail you this pamphlet. So I would have this booklet a month and a half ahead of the election with everybody that's on my ballot, with pros and cons, who's supporting each candidate, statements, counter statements, and as well as for all the initiatives and bills. And then I went to Philadelphia for my master's, and I went to go vote, and I was like, well, where's your voter ballot? Nobody had any idea what I was talking about. And that was the first time I saw one of those, you pull the lever and it goes for your partisan voting thing. So there is a distinct lack of civic education, and some states are much better about advocating for the education of their electorate than others. That is fortunately or unfortunately the result of our federalist system, where we give states so much leeway in how they can conduct themselves. Benefits citizens of Washington, does not benefit apparently the majority of the rest of the country as far as electoral education goes. So all of this does lead to a lot of vote dilution. Students, one of the primary reasons why young adults don't vote, they don't know how. They weren't taught in school. Just literally, how do you vote? How do you register? What does it look like on election day? How do you figure out the information that you need? And why does it impact you? That also extends to a lot of marginalized communities where they are intentionally not told how voting actually matters. They don't see people who look like them. The majority of elected officials don't respond to their needs. So then, yeah, it seems like, well, why should I vote? Because my two options aren't going to be able to do anything for me. This is the epitome of bad representation. So good representation is when people can have the opportunity to elect their first choice candidate. And most marginalized communities can't, because of this long ingrained and generations long process of disenfranchisement and marginalization. So I think how to tie all that together is we see with COVID the disparate negative impacts of a lack of representation, right? So if you had stronger representation, if you had a more responsive representative body, you wouldn't see the same negative impacts. The only way to correct that is to increase engagement, and sustained engagement only happens through civic education, which we theoretically think happens in schools, but it doesn't.
Before I read out another question, is there anyone who would like to ask a question on video or? Okay.
I would like to clarify the question that I had asked initially in chat.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
And I just wanted to know your opinion about the organizations who are focused on social justice issues, yet have not made significant change in many of the systemic racism, that's evident in our institutions, across the country. And I'm saying this from a perspective of living in 3 different urban communities in 3 different states without seeing any major changes in education, in housing, in medical. So these things are still systemically wrong, and they've been systemically wrong for years.
Yes. And I would say that the reason why these organizations haven't gained more traction is because the broader community hasn't been willing to acknowledge them as having a point, having valid points. And so that goes back to the race talk and the abstractness of the discussion of these policies. So like with healthcare, the reason why healthcare is through your employer rather than through the federal government was because in the South, they didn't want freed slaves to have access to good health, because then you're a more controllable population if you're sick. Because if you're worried about, I need to go to the doctor, or I'm really sick, you have a life-threatening or a life complication, then you don't have the energy or the time to worry about, well, how am I going to pass the literacy test to get to the poll, right? So it is a deliberate form of social control with explicitly racial roots, but people don't want to hear that today because, oh, well, I've paid in to my system, or like we have all of these excuses or explanations that are common, right? And they're valid if you don't understand the history. Okay, but we're just not teaching that history. So until there's a broader understanding that this is actually a problem that needs to be addressed, and we can all come together in order to make a change, then the size of the problem precludes these smaller organizations from being able to make effective change. Does that answer your question?
It does. I have a different opinion, though. I think that
Okay.
there's a deeper level of racism among the socioeconomic classes within these particular areas. And I think a lot of these organizations tend to cater to the middle class and not to those who are at the lower level socioeconomic class, for reasons that you had talked about, earlier, in terms of the lack of power for financing these organizations, for allowing these organizations to move forward in their mission. And I think that level of social justice, right, that gives that dividing line in terms of socioeconomic power is kind of a whole nother level that has to be addressed, even when some of the bigger issues have been addressed.
Yes, that's a really good point as well. So then you get into looking at different organizations with different histories. And so a lot of the Latino organizations that I know are focused on actually the most marginalized, and then some organizations are not. And there actually has been a lot of work on, I'm thinking especially of Kathy Cohen and Dar Stralovich, looking at community or service organizations that work to maintain the same racialized hierarchy within their minority serving organization as well. So that would be exactly to your point.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Oh, so I have a comment here based on your last one. Interesting comment about lack of civics education. Our little country high school in Pennsylvania had both mandatory civics and mandatory problems of democracy classes. Those classes included practice political debates, voting, registration, how absentee ballots work, and when they can be used, proper identification, and the importance of actually voting. That was many decades ago. My children and grandchildren have not had such classes despite attending suburban, higher quality, better funded schools. And then a question here. Did I understand you to say that employer health insurance is racially biased against Black/underprivileged?
No, it was in how it was created. So when when this country was originally working on which social services to provide. Sorry, after I talk a little bit on Zoom, I lose the ability to enunciate. When which social services was the government going to provide was being decided, it was decided that at that point that health insurance would not be provided by the federal government in the same way that something like retirement benefits, Social Security would be, because of an explicitly racial desire to keep Blacks without health care. If there is racial bias in healthcare today, that's not one of my particular areas of expertise. As far as, I mean, I could offer some speculations, but that is a little bit a field of what it is that I know for sure.
Another question is, why did Trump get more votes from people of color than Romney?
I don't know that he actually did. So if you look at the Latino vote, that might be the population specifically that you're looking at or thinking of. The exit polls were wrong, to put it bluntly. So little known secret or dirty secret about exit polls is they used to be conducted by 5 different corporations across the country, and they'd go to different precincts. And so then you would have at least somewhat more variety in your sources of information about how did people vote across the country. Right now, we only have one organization that's doing the exit polls that everybody reports. So then if that one company, that one organization doesn't appropriately identify precincts to poll, meaning they do not choose precincts with enough demographic and geographic diversity, then their numbers are going to be off. And so when it comes to the Latino vote specifically, they did not poll enough of the Latino precincts. And so if you look at Latino Decisions, they actually wrote an article on this. Oh gosh, I forget, I used to know what it was called, but it came out shortly after the last election, and it demonstrated that the percentage of Latinos who voted for Trump was actually much lower than what the exit polls reported.
All right. So another question is, I see some groups and individuals using outdated terms such as colored and rationalizing it by saying that it's still being used by the NAACP, for example, or because they misunderstood the use of person first language and the terms person of color. How can the misunderstanding, unintentional and sadly intentional, be clarified and shifted so the language changes more broadly? I see BIPOC being used by those conscious of systemic racism, but not by all.
I think it's really about, and I would look at it as an educational moment. If somebody chooses to say colored, say, oh, well, why are you using that term? Right? And sometimes calling out because of the implicitness of race talk, and say something very, very clearly of, well, that's actually considered to be derogatory terminology, so you could use people of color instead. And if somebody doesn't want to, you could just say, well, then you're choosing your comfort over the people who you are talking about. Right? Something as simple as that is, I try to advocate for my students to not become emotionally involved with stuff like that and to not take it personally, even though it's really, really hard not to, because it is personal. And so, but it is difficult to make change without naming the problem and making people aware of how large the problem is in the first place. I think the BIPOC term is interesting. I don't know if it's going to have legs, but I also said that about Latinx and I was wrong, so I could be, again, completely wrong. What I think is interesting about BIPOC is, for those who don't know the term, I think it's more widely used on the West Coast than on the East Coast. It's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in order to acknowledge the very distinct histories and experiences of Black populations from Indigenous populations from other people of color. I kind of view the term BIPOC as a double-edged sword, because if we actually taught the real history of the United States with our communities of color, then the term BIPOC wouldn't be necessary. And so, and that, from that perspective, it's both good and bad. And I will also say that with terms like Latinx and BIPOC, if people choose to self-refer, then I don't, you know, that's great. I do think it is more difficult with particularly new terminology that tends to have an advocacy or a political bent. It becomes more complicated when people say everybody should be using these terms, okay? Because there isn't actually widespread consensus on those terms, right? Like, whereas there's widespread consensus that you shouldn't use the N-word, you know, there isn't necessarily consensus between Black and African American, because a lot of people choose to self-identify. Within the Latino community, some people say Chicano, but not all Mexican Americans identify as Chicano. Some identify as Latinx, some identify as Latina, some identify as Latino, some don't identify as Latino at all, right? So it's about making sure that we're people, when we're talking about terminology, acknowledge these advancements, but then we also need to make sure that within or without communities that we're not telling people how they should self-identify.
So we have time for about 2 more questions. Does anyone want to ask one, or I can read from the chat box? Okay. What can you specifically cite regarding racial bias during deciding about the federal health care? I think this is.
I don't know that off the top of my head. That's something that you could probably, it's probably Googleable at this point. And if you shoot me an email, then I could look up the resource for you.
Okay. Is it true that our population becoming increasingly multiracial will ultimately reduce racism in the US or lead to further polarization, perhaps age polarization?
That is an unknown. So there's a book that I use to teach. It's called The Future is Ours by Sean Bowler and Gary Segura. And the premise of the book is that the increasing demographic diversity will logically lead to, and inevitably lead to, a dominance of the Democratic Party. Because the Republican Party, as it is formed now, has hitched its wagon to white voters and to the exclusion of communities of color. They self-admittedly acknowledge that this is way too unnuanced of a perspective, because we can't assume that just because somebody's not white means that they all want the same things and they come together. There does need to be a significant amount of coalition building, shared values, shared desires for outcomes, versus competition between communities of color if we were to see something like that happen. So would it lead to increased polarization? That's, I would say, potentially not, only because there are more racial groups than there are polls, so to speak. So it would probably come down to more of, because of our electoral system, if politics remain so contentious, how do the parties shake out? And is there the creation of another party? Which isn't unheard of, as we had like with the Federalists in the past. We could have a 3-party system that would eventually shake out back down into a 2-party system. But what are people going to coalesce around really depends on how coalitions are built and formed and where we start to see the competition between groups.
Okay. So I think that is, there's one question in here, but I would need a little clarification on it. Oh, okay. I will ignore. But I think that's all our questions, unless I missed anything. If I missed anything, please feel free to speak up or write it in the chat box. All right. Well, thank you very much. Do you have any closing remarks?
No, thank you all for joining on this very large and complicated topic. I do try as much of normative positions that are implicit in this type of talk. I do hope that I was able to provide enough fact and history in order to support the positions that I put forth. And please do let me know if you have any further questions. I'd be happy to continue chatting with any of you.
Awesome. And yes, thank you all for joining. Please continue to check out our website. We have more of these faculty lectures coming up, as well as other items as well. So it's at www.alumni.pace.edu/stuttersgonevirtual. I will send you all that information in a follow-up email. So thank you all. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.